That was Mew, a Danish band, and their latest single called Repeater Beater, here tonight on Think Globally Radio, the Environment and Sustainable Development Show, heard at 7 o'clock on Sunday evenings on THS Radio, and all of our past programs archived up on thinkgloballyradio.org. And if you like what you've heard so far tonight and you want to hear more from Ambassador Mitchell, you can go into our archive and find 2 previous programs. The most recent one was about a year ago, and I think about 6 months before that was the first time that you were on the show, Andrew Mitchell, the British ambassador to Sweden, very active in climate change. Obviously, this is something you're very well read on. I mean, I don't know all the things an ambassador does, but this seems to be something pretty close to your heart. If you would know in such detail all the minutiae, all the policy details around climate change, and what. From a British standpoint, what kind of activities are you doing here in Stockholm, with Sweden being the EU president at the moment? Obviously, a very important position with the upcoming negotiations. How do you interface with the Swedish presidency in terms of your role here as ambassador around climate change? That is,
on climate change. Well, absolutely. I mean, as far as we're concerned, Sweden, which has the responsibility for coordinating EU action on climate change issues generally within the presidency. This is, obviously a very important relationship from our perspective, and we interact with Sweden as presidency in lots and lots of different ways. There's obviously a lot going on in Brussels in the context of the European Union there, where Sweden is negotiating a lot of what the European Union is doing in the context of the approach to the negotiations. There's a lot going on sort of in New York, directly capital to capital, fantastic contacts between our negotiating teams. And similarly here, we try to do what we can to kind of make sure that Sweden understands our perspective on the issues. From time to time, I'll make quite a lot of speeches and presentations on the issue to help the Swedes to keep levels of global ambition high. But we talk a lot to the Swedish authorities and the administration here. We talk to Swedish ministers. We have a lot of visitors coming in, going backwards and forwards between Sweden and the UK. And we try to make sure that when those meetings take place, people understand each other's perspective and that we've got a way of getting agreement on issues quickly. By and large, I have to say the relationship between Sweden and the UK on climate change issues is fantastic. And that's because we tend to see these issues more or less the same way around.
Okay, and one thing you mentioned in the first half of the program tonight was regarding the treaty itself. Yeah. And we discussed this a little bit while the song was playing, but let's share this with the audience. And what caught my attention was when you said that the treaty has to be shortened. That's progress. The shorter, the more you can cut out, the better. The simplification of the treaty, whether this is going to be the Copenhagen Protocol or called something else or something that'll finally be finalized a year or so from now. But what are we expecting in Copenhagen? What is left to do? What is and what are we trying to achieve in Copenhagen in terms of formulating this global agreement?
Well, I mean, we are very clear indeed that what has to be achieved in Copenhagen is a binding political agreement. And a binding political agreement, even if we don't get the fully fledged legal agreement effectively ratified, negotiated in Copenhagen, we have to have a binding political agreement between the leaders there. And what that means is that the main components of that deal have to be discussed and agreed between the leaders. And when I talk about the main components, I'm talking here about the things that we've been discussing earlier on in the programme. It's about financing, and it's about significant transfers of financing, both in terms of mitigation, adaptation. Secondly, we've got to agree the responsibilities for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from our countries, and this is about actually committing to significant reductions in the way that we emit carbon, both in terms of, and particularly in terms of the developed countries, but also a big departure from business as usual for developing countries. The reality is that if you look at the trajectory for the growth in carbon emissions, as we all know, it's the majority of the growth in carbon emissions over the next few years is going to be from the developing economies. So we're not going to be in a position to maintain that 2-degree target unless we also have commitments to significant changes in business as usual from the developing countries. And part of the financing aspect of the deal is about how those departures, that change in business as usual, is actually paid for, and the responsibility of the developed countries for financing that. So we need financing sorted, we need governance sorted, we need to understand that we're going to regulate this in a particular way, and we talked about that earlier on. We've also got to have serious commitments to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and there's a whole bunch of other things that we can talk about, but that's the core of it. And if we get leaders to go to Copenhagen and to stand up and say, we're committed to this deal, then in a sense the rest is how you put that legal agreement together. And that is something that will follow.
I know this is a widely used shorthand, so to speak, this dichotomy between developed and developing. Do you think that that's still relevant at this point? I mean, because it implies there's like two half to the world, and it seems like even in the European Union, countries like Poland have made some complaints that we shouldn't be bearing the same brunt as Sweden or the UK or Germany, and then in the developing world, you have countries like China that are emitting quite a bit more per capita even than other countries such as India, which are two countries that are often lumped together. Not to mention even far less developed countries in Africa and other places as well. Do you think that this is still a relevant way, or is the treaty going to address this in some sort of hierarchical way, or is it going to say developed and developing and that's it?
This actually comes from the original Kyoto Agreement, which has an annex in it, and they're called this is Annex 1, in fact, and the Annex 1 countries are the developed countries, who in effect take responsibility for the historic problem of the growth in carbon emissions, and who commit to taking responsibility also for helping to finance the solution. So although this distinction risks creating conflict and dispute and sounding as though it's the rich world against the poor world, the North against the South once again, actually there's an important reason why we have to talk in these terms, and that is about responsibility. And as we've said before, making those responsibilities clear and binding them into the agreement is absolutely at the core of it. Without that, then the agreement won't exist. And so, although there is a risk here, and there's a risk that this becomes a debate or an argument or a dispute between the developing and the developed, it's a necessary issue. Secondly, yes, of course, if we were to we can't put the sort of very poor economies of the developing world in the same box as the big growing economies, and particularly China here, but India too, and others. But China and India, very big, very fast growing economies that will produce, and particularly China is going to produce a fantastic amount of carbon unless there's a significant departure from business as usual, and that requires special treatment, and will get special treatment in the deal. But what is required here is, in effect, a transition to a low-carbon economy. Now, the Chinese leadership is signalling that it is committed to this, but it wants the help of the developed economies. And here we come back to this question. Even for China, even for an economy like China, it has to have assistance along the way, and that's about technology. It's about supporting low-carbon development.